For 7 years, the silence of the Wyoming Territory was Adelaide's only constant companion. It was in the whispering pines, the sighing wind across the plains, and the hollow echo of her own footsteps on the cabin's porch. Her grief was a shadow she lived inside a fortress built from solitude. She had buried her husband and son, and with them any desire for the outside world. She knew the language of the seasons, the rifle and the trap line, but she had forgotten the sound of another human voice. Until one storm-racked evening, a silhouette blotted out the horizon, a man the size of a mountain holding a bundle that was crying. The year was 1878. The name on the deed-gathering dust in a locked chest was Adelaide Parsons. To the few trappers who might pass her homestead once a season, she was just the widow, a phantom spoken of in hushed tones in the distant town of Redemption. For 7 years, that's all she had been. 7 years since the blizzard had claimed her, Thomas and little Samuel leaving her in a world made of snow and silence. When the snow melted, the silence remained. Her life was a rhythm of survival. Dawn broke with the sharp crack of the wood axe. Days were spent tending her meager garden, checking rabbit snares, mending the perpetually failing fence, and cleaning the rifle that was her only true law. Evenings were spent by the fire, the same fire that had once warmed 3 people, now seeming to offer only a fraction of its heat to one. She was not unhappy, nor was she happy. She simply was, a feature of the landscape as weathered and unmoving as the granite peaks that watched over her valley. This particular October evening, the sky had turned a bruised purple. The wind, usually a low moan, began to shriek like a banshee, tearing at the cabin's chinking. A storm was coming. Not a gentle rain, but a furious, cold-lashing monster of the high plains. Adelaide had secured the shutters, brought in extra firewood, and checked on her mare Daisy, who was restless in her lean-to. As she latched the heavy cabin door, she felt the familiar grim satisfaction of self-reliance. Let the storm rage. It couldn't take anything more from her. An hour later, as the rain hammered the roof in a deafening tattoo, she heard it. A sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the wind, nor the scuttling of a critter. It was a cry. A thin, desperate wail, almost swallowed by the gale. Adelaide froze her hand, hovering over the stew pot. She strained to listen. It came again, sharper this time. A baby. Her heart, a dormant, petrified thing, gave a painful lurch. It was impossible. No one was out here. No one could be out here, especially not in this. She grabbed her rifle from its pegs by the door, the cold steel a familiar comfort. She peered through the small, grimy window pane, wiping away the condensation. Through the sheets of rain, she saw him, a figure on horseback, slumped over, yet immense. The horse looked half dead, head bowed against the wind. The man slid from the saddle, his movements heavy and exhausted. He was a giant, his frame made even larger by a sodden oilskin duster. In his arms he clutched a small, blanket-wrapped bundle. It was from this bundle that the cries emanated. He stumbled towards her cabin, the only point of light and hope in 100 square miles of unforgiving wilderness. Her first instinct was pure cold fear. A man this size could take whatever he wanted. Her second instinct, a deeper and more painful one, was stirred by the sound of the baby's cry. It was the sound her own Samuel had made when he was hungry or cold. He reached her door, and his fist hammered against the wood, the sound like a death knell. "Please, ma'am." Anyone in there, for the love of God?" Please, Adelaide's knuckles were white on the stock of her rifle. Her voice, rough from disuse, was a low growl. "State your business. Who are you?" "Name's Clayton Munro. My horse is spent. The storm. We got caught. I've got a baby with me. She's cold. We just need a roof. Just for the night. I've got money. I'll do no harm, I swear it." His voice was a deep baritone, ragged with desperation, but lacking malice. Still, 7 years of solitude had taught her that desperation was its own kind of danger. "No room here," she called back, her voice firmer than she felt. The baby's cry escalated into a full-blown, heart-rending scream. It sliced through Adelaide's defenses like a hot knife. She could almost feel the phantom weight of her own son in her arms. The man's voice cracked. "Please, Ma'am." "Not for me, for her. Her name is Rose. She ain't done nothing to this world to deserve freezing to death in it." Adelaide closed her eyes. The image of Samuel, his small body still and cold, flashed behind her eyelids. She just couldn't listen to a baby die on her doorstep. It was a price too high even for her solitude. With a deep, shuddering breath, she slid the heavy bolt back. The door creaked open, and the wind howled into the room, threatening to extinguish her lamp. The man Clayton Munro stood there, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. He was even bigger up close, well over 6 feet, with shoulders as broad as the doorway. His face was stark and angular, stubbled with a dark beard and etched with exhaustion. But it was his eyes that held her. They weren't cruel or predatory. They were a clear, desperate blue, and they were fixed on her with a plea that went beyond words. "Thank you." He breathed the words, fogging in the cold air. "God bless you, ma'am." She just nodded curtly, stepping back and gesturing with the rifle barrel towards the hearth. "Get in, and close that door before you blow out my lamp." He shuffled inside, seeming to fill her small cabin with his presence. He moved with a surprising gentleness, cradling the crying baby against his chest. As the door thudded shut, plunging the room back into a dim, firelit quiet, the silence of Adelaide's life was officially, irrevocably broken. The giant and the child were inside her fortress, and as he began to unwrap the sodden blankets from the tiny, shivering infant, Adelaide felt the first terrifying crack appear in the wall she had built around her heart. The first night was a study in tension. Clayton Munro sat on a low stool by the fire, his massive frame hunched over the infant. He stripped away her wet clothes with hands that looked clumsy but moved with unpracticed tenderness. Adelaide, from the far side of the room, watched him with the wary stillness of a hawk. She had given him a dry blanket and a bowl of her venison stew, which he ate with a quiet, ravenous hunger. "She needs warm milk," he said, his voice low, not looking up from the baby. Adelaide's chest tightened. She hadn't milked her goat for anything other than her own use in years. The thought of it, the simple domestic act, felt like a betrayal of her grief. "Don't have any," she lied, her voice flat. The baby Rose let out another pitiful cry. Clayton rocked her, gently murmuring, "I know, little one. I know." He looked up at Adelaide, his blue eyes meeting her dark, guarded ones across the flickering room. "Water, then." Warmed. Adelaide ladled some water from the kettle into a tin cup and handed it to him, careful not to let their fingers touch. She watched as he patiently tipped tiny drops into the baby's mouth. The cabin was filled with alien sounds, the baby's soft whimpers, the man's deep, soothing murmurs, the rustle of his movements. It was an intrusion, an invasion of the sacred quiet she had cultivated. He laid Rose in a makeshift bed in a wooden crate near the fire, and she finally quieted her tiny chest, rising and falling in the shallow sleep of exhaustion. Clayton sagged with relief, running a hand over his weary face. "She your daughter?" Adelaide asked, her voice betraying a sliver of curiosity she couldn't suppress. He hesitated, his gaze drifting to the sleeping child. "No, ma'am. She's my niece. My wife's sister's girl. Where's her mother?" A shadow passed over his features, so deep and swift it was like a cloud covering the sun. "She passed. A fever back in Colorado." And the father Clayton's jaw tightened. He picked up a stick and poked at the fire, the flames illuminating the hard line of his mouth. "He's the reason we're traveling." It was a veiled answer, a clear warning not to pry further. Adelaide respected it. She knew all about reasons for traveling and reasons for stopping. She pointed with her chin toward the small loft. "You can sleep up there. I'll take the floor. I can't take your bed, ma'am. It's not a bed. It's a loft with a straw mattress, and you're not taking it. I'm giving you the choice of that or the floor. Makes no difference to me." Her tone was brittle, leaving no room for argument. He simply nodded a silent "thank you" in his eyes, and climbed the ladder. Sleep did not come easily to Adelaide. She lay on her pallet, the rifle beside her, listening to the man's deep, even breathing from the loft above, and the occasional soft sigh from the baby in the crate. They were ghosts of a life she had lost. Each breath they took was a reminder of the breaths that had ceased in this very cabin. The storm raged for 2 full days. The world outside was a churning grey chaos, trapping the 3 of them together in the small fire-lit space. The one night he had asked for stretched into 2, then 3. The tension slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to change. It started with small things. On the second morning, she awoke to find he had already been outside. The woodpile by the door was stacked high, replenished from the larger pile near the woodshed. He hadn't asked. He had just seen a need and filled it. When he came back in shaking snow from his duster, he didn't speak of it. He just nodded a greeting and went to check on Rose. Adelaide found herself watching him. He was a man of few words, but constant useful motion. He noticed a loose hinge on her cupboard, and with a tool from his saddlebag, fixed it until it swung silently. He saw the frayed rope on her well bucket, and replaced it with a newer, stronger one of his own. He moved about her space with a quiet respect that began to chip away at her stony reserve. He wasn't trying to take over. He was trying to earn his keep. The true thaw, however, came because of Rose. On the 3rd day, the baby was fretful, crying with a colic that Clayton's rocking couldn't soothe. He looked utterly exhausted, his face pale beneath his beard. "Let me." Adelaide said the words leaving her mouth before she could stop them. He looked up surprised. She walked over and held out her arms. Hesitantly, he passed the warm, squirming bundle to her. The moment Rose was in her arms, a jolt went through Adelaide. It was a physical memory her body had not forgotten. The weight, the warmth, the specific way a baby fits against a woman's shoulder. Rose, perhaps sensing a different touch, quieted her frantic crying to a low, unhappy grumble. Adelaide began to walk, pacing the worn floorboards of her cabin in the same pattern she had walked with Samuel countless nights. She hummed a tune without realizing it, a wordless lullaby that her own mother had hummed to her. Clayton watched his expression unreadable. He saw not just a woman holding a baby, but the ghost of a mother tending to her child. Rose eventually fell asleep against Adelaide's chest. Adelaide stood still for a long time, breathing in the scent of milk and baby powder. Her eyes closed. When she finally laid the child back in her crate, her hands were trembling. She turned and saw Clayton looking at her, a profound sadness and gratitude in his eyes. "You're good with her," he said softly. "I had a son," she replied, the first time she had spoken of Samuel to another soul in years. "He'd have been about 8 now." She didn't offer more, and he didn't ask. But something had shifted. A shared, unspoken understanding of loss now hung in the air between them. It was a fragile bridge, but it was there. That evening, the silence at dinner was different. It was no longer tense and hostile, but comfortable, companionable. "The storm's breaking," Clayton observed, looking at the sliver of pale light at the edge of a shutter. "We can be on our way in the morning." I don't have the words to thank you, Mrs. Parsons." "Adelaide," she corrected him, the name feeling strange on her own tongue. "Adelaide," he repeated, "we owe you our lives." "You fixed my cupboard," she said, a deflection. "We're even." He gave a small, weary smile. Not hardly. As she banked the fire for the night, a sense of unease settled in her stomach. It wasn't fear of him anymore. It was the opposite. The thought of the cabin falling silent again, of the morning, coming with no wood stacked by the door, no baby sighing in a crate by the fire. The thought of returning to her perfect, lonely solitude was suddenly unbearable. The next morning, the world was white and glistening. The storm had passed. Clayton was saddling his horse, a powerful roan that looked much recovered after 3 days of rest and feed. He packed his few belongings, his movements deliberate. Adelaide stood on the porch, her arms crossed against the morning chill. "Where will you go?" "North," he said vaguely, "towards the Milk River country. Heard a man can start fresh there." "It's hard country." "I'm used to hard," he replied, tying the cradle board that held Rose securely behind his saddle. The moment had come. He would mount up, ride away, and her life would return to what it was. The fortress would be whole again. So why did it feel like she was the one being left behind in a prison? As he put his foot in the stirrup, Adelaide looked out across the valley. Her eyes, sharpened by years of scanning the horizon for game or danger, caught something. Far to the south, at the edge of the tree line, a glint of light. It wasn't sunlight on ice. It was metal. A spyglass, maybe. And then she saw them. 2 riders sitting their horses, just watching. They were too far to make out details, but their stillness was menacing. "Clayton," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Don't ride out. We've got company." He followed her gaze, his whole body going rigid. The easygoing demeanor of the past few days vanished, replaced by the hardened, dangerous man she had first seen. "Damn him!" He breathed a low curse filled with a cold fury. "Damn his soul to hell." He pulled his horse back toward the lean-to and quickly unstrapped the baby. "They can't have seen me leave the cabin yet." "Who are they?" Adelaide demanded, her hand already reaching for the rifle inside the door. He looked at her, his blue eyes blazing with a fire she hadn't seen before. The time for partial truths was over. "They're men who work for a man named Beaufort Kane," he said, his voice grim. "And they aren't here for me, Adelaide. They're here for the baby." Clayton brought the baby back inside, his movements swift and economical. The brief illusion of peace had shattered, replaced by the chilling reality of the 2 distant riders. Adelaide bolted the door, her mind racing. For 7 years, her dangers had been blizzards, wolves, and loneliness. Now a human threat sat on her horizon, and it had a name: Beaufort Kane. "Talk," she commanded, her voice leaving no room for evasion. She leaned her rifle by the door and began methodically checking the loads in a Colt revolver she retrieved from the locked chest. The pistol felt heavy and real in her hand. Clayton gently placed the sleeping Rose back into her crate, tucking the blankets around her. He took a deep breath, the air of a man about to unburden himself of a terrible weight. "Beaufort Kane owns most of the land and the souls in the part of Colorado we just fled." He began, his eyes dark with memory. "He's a man who believes the world is his for the taking. Rich as Croesus and twice as cruel." He paused, glancing at Rose. "That baby's mother, Lily, was my late wife's sister, and she was Beaufort Kane's only daughter." Adelaide stopped her work, the pistol feeling suddenly colder in her grip. The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture far more dangerous than she had imagined. Kane despised the man. Lily married Clayton continued, his voice low and laced with contempt. A simple ranch foreman. Good man, but not good enough for Kane's dynasty. When Lily's husband died in a ranching accident that everyone knew wasn't an accident, Kane tried to force her to marry a business partner of his, a man older than him with hands that wandered. Lily refused. He walked to the window, peering cautiously through a crack in the shutters. The riders hadn't moved. When Lily found out she was pregnant, she knew she had to run. Kane didn't see a grandchild. He saw an heir, a pawn, a way to control his legacy and her life forever. He would have taken the baby and locked Lily away in some sanatorium. So my wife Martha and we helped her escape. We were supposed to meet her in a town called Dusty Creek, but we were too late. His voice broke, and for the first time Adelaide saw a raw, unguarded grief on his face. A fever took Martha first. Then while I was burying my own wife, word came that Lily had made it to the next town over, but the childbirth had been too hard on her. She was gone. Before she died, she gave Rose to a preacher and left a letter for me. She begged me to take the baby to get her as far away from her father as possible. She wanted her to have a life, not be a possession. "So you're not her uncle?" Adelaide stated, her gaze unwavering. "By marriage only. But I made a promise to a dying woman. I'm all this little girl has." He turned from the window, his expression hardening again. "Kane found out I have her. He's been hunting us ever since we left Colorado. He won't stop. Not until he has her back under his thumb." Adelaide processed the story, the sheer terrible scope of it. This wasn't a simple dispute. It was a war against a powerful, ruthless man. A man who would send armed riders into the wilderness to retrieve a baby. Her valley, her sanctuary, had become a battlefield. "Those men out there," she said, gesturing with her head. "They're just scouts, likely. Caleb is probably one of them. He's Kane's lead tracker, cunning as a coyote. They'll wait. Try to see if I'm alone. Kane won't risk a direct assault unless he's sure of the odds." A cold fury began to burn in Adelaide's chest. For 7 years, she had asked nothing of the world but to be left alone in her grief. Now this man, Kane, was reaching his greedy hands into her world, threatening not just the man and child who had breached her solitude, but the very peace she had paid for with her heart. "You should have kept riding," she said, the words a test. "You brought his trouble to my door." Clayton's face fell. He looked at her, his blue eyes filled with a weary shame. "You're right," he said quietly. "I never should have stopped. It was selfish. I saw your light in the storm, and I was at the end of my rope. I'll leave right now. I'll draw them off. You'll be safe here." He moved toward the door, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He was ready to walk back out into the wilderness, to face those men alone to protect her. And in that moment, Adelaide made a choice. It wasn't a logical choice. It was a choice born of the memory of a baby's weight in her arms, of the quiet satisfaction of seeing a mended cupboard hinge, of the shared, silent understanding of loss. It was the choice to stop being a ghost. "Don't be a fool, Monroe," she snapped, her voice sharp as flint. "You'll be dead before you clear the first ridge, and they'll get the baby anyway." He stopped, turning to look at her in confusion. "You said it yourself." She continued, her mind now working with a clarity she hadn't felt in years. "They're watching. They don't know who's in here with you. Kane won't risk his men if he thinks he's riding into an ambush." She walked to the fireplace and picked up a second rifle, an older but still reliable Winchester. She tossed it to him. He caught it with an easy familiarity. "This is my land," she said, her voice low and fierce. "That man Kane has no claim here. No one has for 7 years. I buried my family in this valley. I'll not have it desecrated by him or his hired guns." Clayton stared at her, a slow dawning astonishment on his face. He was seeing the woman she had been, before the grief, the woman who had helped her husband build this cabin with her own 2 hands, who had faced down the wilderness and bent it to her will. "Adelaide." He started, his voice thick with emotion. "Save it." She cut him off. "We've got work to do. You know these men. I know this land. If they want a war, we'll give them one, from a fortress of their own making." She unbolted a heavy floor hatch he hadn't noticed, revealing a dark, stone-lined root cellar. "Get the baby and some supplies down there. It's the safest place. Then you and I are going to get acquainted with the art of a defensive perimeter." For the first time in a very long time, Adelaide Parsons felt something other than the dull ache of loss. It was a cold, sharp, and intensely focused rage. Her solitude was no longer a weakness. It was a weapon. She knew every rock, every tree, every gully and ravine in this valley. The riders thought they were besieging a lonely cabin. They were about to find out they had stepped into a spider's web. The day passed in a blur of tense preparation. The sun climbed high, turning the snow-covered valley into a blindingly white expanse. The 2 riders remained distant and patient, like vultures waiting for a sign of weakness. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere crackled with purpose. "Caleb the tracker." "He's cagey," Clayton explained, peering through the slight gap in the window. "He'll try to circle around, find a high point, get a view of the cabin from all sides. The other one, if it's who I think it is a brute named Tanner. All muscle, no thought. He'll follow Caleb's lead." "There's a ridge to the west," Adelaide said, pointing on a crude map she'd drawn in the hearth ash on the floor. "It overlooks the whole cabin. It's the only real vantage point. But the approach is a narrow game trail exposed on both sides." "He'll go there," Clayton said with certainty. "Then that's where we'll greet him," she replied, a grim smile touching her lips. They worked together with an efficiency that belied their short acquaintance. They were 2 solitary people who understood the language of survival. Adelaide barricaded the windows, leaving small, clever firing slits. Clayton, using his strength, moved heavy furniture to reinforce the door. They filled every spare bucket and pot with water from the well, making quick, silent trips. Down in the root cellar, Rose slept soundly oblivious to the storm gathering above her. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, casting long blue shadows on the snow, they saw movement. One of the riders, as predicted, began a wide, circling path towards the western ridge. The other remained in place a sentinel. "That'll be Caleb Clayton," muttered. "Let's go," Adelaide said. She slipped out the back door, a grey shawl thrown over her shoulders, making her a mere shadow against the darkening trees. Clayton followed his large frame, moving with a hunter's silence. They didn't use the main path, but a winding, nearly invisible trail Adelaide had worn over the years, one that kept them deep within the cover of the pines. They reached the ridge first, positioning themselves behind a rocky outcrop that gave them a perfect view of the game trail below. The air was bitingly cold. They lay side by side on the frozen ground, rifles resting on the rock, the silence broken only by the whisper of the wind. Lying so close to him, Adelaide was aware of his solid presence, the faint scent of pine and leather. It was a strange, grounding intimacy in the face of imminent violence. Minutes later, Caleb appeared. He was a weaselly man, moving with a nervous energy, his eyes constantly scanning. He led his horse up the trail, dismounted, and crept towards the very ridge they occupied, seeking the vantage point. "Wait for him to settle, Adelaide," whispered her breath, fogging. Caleb reached the crest not 20 yards from them. He tethered his horse and raised a spyglass to his eye, focusing on the cabin below. "Now," Clayton said. The 2 rifle shots cracked as one, the sound echoing through the valley like the wrath of God. They hadn't aimed for Caleb. Adelaide's bullet splintered the rock an inch from his head, spraying his face with stone chips. Clayton's shot struck the ground at his feet. Caleb yelped in shock and terror, dropping his spyglass. He scrambled backward, eyes wide with panic. He had expected a lone, desperate man. He hadn't expected coordinated expert rifle fire from the one place he thought was safe. "Beaufort Kane has no authority in this valley," Adelaide shouted, her voice carrying on the cold, clear air. "Leave now, or the next shots won't be warnings." Caleb didn't need a second invitation. He crab-walked back to his horse, fumbled with the reins, and galloped back down the trail in a blind panic. From their perch, they watched him race across the valley floor to his companion. After a brief, frantic exchange, both men spurred their horses and retreated south, disappearing into the twilight. Adelaide and Clayton remained on the ridge, watching until they were certain they were gone. The immediate danger had passed. "You were right," Clayton said, his voice full of awe. "You turned their own plan against them." "They'll be back," she said, her pragmatism undimmed by the victory. "And they'll bring more men. That was just a skirmish. Kane won't be deterred by a couple of well-placed shots." They returned to the cabin, the tension easing slightly, replaced by a shared sense of accomplishment. That night, Adelaide insisted Clayton take the loft. She felt no need to sleep on the floor with a rifle. She trusted him. The shared danger had forged a bond stronger than any lock. For 3 days, a fragile peace reigned. They fell into a domestic rhythm always punctuated by vigilance. Clayton handled the heavy chores, chopping wood, hauling water, while Adelaide cared for Rose and maintained their watch. They spoke more filling in the empty spaces of their pasts. He told her about his late wife Martha, her kindness and her laughter. Adelaide in turn spoke of Thomas, of his dream to build a small cattle herd, and of Samuel's fascination with grasshoppers. They were sharing ghosts, letting the light into the darkest corners of their hearts. Adelaide found herself rediscovering parts of herself she thought were long dead. She laughed at one of Clayton's dry observations. She found a strange joy in watching Rose's tiny fist curl around her finger. The silence of the cabin was no longer lonely. It was filled with a quiet, living presence. On the fourth morning, their peace was shattered. Clayton, on watch from the loft window, stiffened. "They're back." Adelaide joined him, her heart pounding. This time there weren't 2 riders. There were 6. And at their head, on a magnificent black stallion, was a man whose expensive coat and arrogant posture screamed authority. Beaufort Kane Clayton said, his voice a low growl. He came himself. Kane and his men stopped 100 yards from the cabin, a safe distance from rifle fire. They didn't charge. They simply sat their horses, a clear and intimidating display of force. Clayton Monroe. Kane's voice boomed across the snow, dripping with condescending power. "I know you're in there. You have something that belongs to me. Send out my granddaughter, and I will let you and whoever you've shacked up with live." "He thinks it's just me and a woman," Clayton whispered to Adelaide. "He's arrogant." "Let him be, Adelaide," whispered back. She looked at Kane, at the sneering certainty on his face, and her cold rage returned, honed to a razor's edge. "I have 6 men," Monroe Kane bellowed. "You have 1 cabin. This can be simple, or it can be bloody. The choice is yours." Clayton raised his rifle to the firing slit. His jaw clenched. "He won't get her." "No." Adelaide agreed, taking her position at the other window. "He won't." Kane waited. When no response came, he gave a sharp nod. His men dismounted, spreading out using the sparse trees for cover as they began to advance on the cabin from multiple directions. The siege had begun. The first shot came from one of Kane's men, thudding into the thick log wall of the cabin. Adelaide and Clayton answered, not with wild firing, but with patient, precise shots. They made the attackers pay for every foot of ground they gained. The valley, once so quiet, erupted in a cacophony of gunfire. They were a brutally effective team. Clayton's steady nerve and marksmanship kept the main force pinned down, while Adelaide, with her intimate knowledge of every angle and weak point, fired on any man who tried to flank them. They communicated in clipped, essential phrases. Left side by the woodpile. Reloading hours crawled by. The attackers were frustrated. They had expected to overwhelm a single man, not fight a tactical 2-person army. As the afternoon sun began to dip, Kane's patience wore thin. "Burn them out!" he roared in frustration. One of his men, Tanner the Brute Clayton had described, made a dash for the cabin with a lit torch aiming for the dry wood of the lean-to. "I can't get a clear shot," Clayton grunted from his position. "I can," Adelaide said grimly. She shifted to a small, low knothole she had used for years to watch for foxes near the coop. It gave her a perfect, if narrow, line of sight. She took a steadying breath, the world shrinking to the space between her eye and the rifle's sight. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. Tanner screamed and dropped the torch, clutching a bloody shoulder as he scrambled back to cover. The lean-to was safe. A furious volley of shots hammered the cabin in retaliation. A bullet splintered the window frame near Adelaide's head, showering her with wood fragments. But she was unmoved. The stalemate held until twilight. Resources were dwindling. They were low on ammunition. Kane knew it. He was preparing for a final desperate rush under the cover of darkness. "There's only one way this ends," Clayton said, his face grim in the fading light. "I have to go out there. I can draw their fire, maybe take Kane himself. It's the only chance." "No," Adelaide said firmly. "That's his plan. There's another way." She looked towards the heavy plank floor. He thinks the fight is in the cabin. He's wrong. She looked at Clayton, a daring, desperate plan forming in her eyes. Trust me. He looked at her, this fierce, resilient woman who had stood by him without question. He nodded. Always. The air in the cabin was thick with the scent of gunpowder and the metallic taste of fear. Outside, the twilight deepened, and Buford Kane's confidence grew with every passing moment of silence. He was a patient predator, certain the prey inside was weakening their resources and their hope dwindling. There's only one way this ends. Clayton said, his voice a low, rough whisper that barely carried across the room. His broad shoulders sagged with a weariness that went bone deep. I have to go out there. I can draw their fire, maybe take Kane himself. It's the only chance. He looked towards the door, his expression set with the grim finality of a man contemplating his own sacrifice. No, Adelaide, said, her voice sharp and immediate, cutting through his fatalistic resolve. That's not a chance, that's an execution. That's his plan, not ours. She moved from the window, her eyes accustomed to the dim light landing on a large bearskin rug that lay before the cold hearth. It was a feature of the room he'd barely noticed. With a grunt of effort, she pulled the heavy rug aside, revealing the dark outlines of a second, less used hatch, its iron ring flush with the floorboards. The old storm cellar. She explained, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial hush. Not the root cellar where Rose is. This one connects to a dry creek bed about 50 yards behind the cabin. My Thomas dug it years ago after a brush fire nearly trapped us. A last resort escape route. We never had to use it. Clayton stared at the hidden door, then back at Adelaide, the cogs of a new, desperate strategy turning in his mind. The plan was audacious, bordering on insane. Born from a deep knowledge of the land and the courage of someone with nothing left to lose. It was their only card left to play. He thinks the fight is in this cabin. Adelaide continued, her eyes alight with a fierce, strategic fire he was beginning to recognize as her true nature. He's wrong. She knelt by the hatch, her gaze locking with his. The question she asked was simple, yet it carried the weight of both their lives and the life of the child sleeping below. Trust me. He looked at her then. This woman who had been a ghost in her own home, now resurrected into a warrior. This woman who had faced his trouble as if it were her own, who had met his desperation with a strength he hadn't known existed. The answer came without hesitation, a bedrock of certainty in a world of chaos, always. Their preparations were swift and silent. While Clayton moved back to the window, ready to provide a final desperate volley of covering fire, Adelaide worked. She gathered the last of their ammunition into a small leather sack. She found a lantern and a tin of kerosene, its potential now shifted from providing light to delivering chaos. She knelt for a fleeting moment beside the root cellar door, placing a hand on the cool wood. Below Rose slept the still point in their swirling world of violence. "It'll be all right, little one." She whispered the words, a promise she would either keep or die trying to fulfill. She pushed the sack of cartridges and the kerosene tin toward Clayton. "Make them count. Give me 10 minutes from the moment I'm in the tunnel. No matter what you hear, wait 10 minutes. Then raise hell at the front door. Make them all look your way." He nodded, his jaw tight. He wanted to argue, to insist he be the one to take the greater risk. But he saw the unyielding resolve in her eyes. This was her land, her plan. To argue would be to dishonor the trust they had just forged. He simply gripped her shoulder for a brief second, a silent prayer and farewell before she lifted the heavy hatch. A wave of cold, earthy air washed over the floor as she slipped into the inky blackness below, pulling the door closed behind her. The tunnel was a cold, tight grave. It smelled of damp soil and stones, a primal scent of the earth's deep places. Adelaide was forced to crawl, the lantern clutched in one hand, the kerosene tin in the other, her body scraping against the narrow walls. The muffled crack of Clayton's rifle fire from above was a distant, irregular heartbeat, counting down the precious seconds. Each shot was a shield buying her more time. The darkness was absolute, pressing in on her, and for a terrifying second, the image of her Thomas and Samuel buried under a world of white flashed in her mind. She squeezed her eyes shut, pushing the grief away, and replacing it with the image of Rose's face. She wasn't crawling away from death. She was crawling towards life. After an eternity that was likely only a few minutes, she saw it. A faint circle of lesser darkness. The exit. She pushed aside a rotten wooden plank and emerged into the dry creek bed, gasping as the bitingly cold night air hit her lungs. The gully was deep, its shadows hiding her completely. Above the sky was a star-dusted canopy, indifferent to the life and death struggle playing out below. Keeping low, her movements as silent as a hunting cat, she scrambled through the snow and underbrush, circling wide. Her target was the lean-to, a structure of dry, weathered pine that housed her mare, Daisy, and fatefully her winter supply of fuel. Inside the cabin, Clayton fired his last bullet. The click of the empty chamber was the loudest sound he had ever heard. The ensuing silence was a physical weight pressing down on him, suffocating him. He strained his ears, listening for any sign of Adelaide, but heard only the sighing of the wind and the distant, contemptuous laughter of one of Kane's men. "He's out of lead," the voice yelled, triumphant. "Tanner Harris, get to the back and finish it. We're going in." Kane's authoritative roar echoed across the clearing. Clayton's heart hammered against his ribs. It was time. Taking a deep, ragged breath, he channeled every ounce of his fear, rage, and desperation into a single, defiant act. He kicked the front door open with a splintering crash and let out a furious, primal yell that tore from his throat. He fired his pistol into the air, a useless, noisy bluff meant to rivet every eye upon him. The gambit worked. Kane and his men, startled by the seemingly suicidal display, focused their entire attention on the lone giant silhouetted in the doorway. At that exact moment, no one saw the small, determined shadow at the back of the property. No one saw the glint of the lantern as Adelaide worked frantically, dousing a pile of old hay and dry timber with the contents of the kerosene tin. She struck a match, its tiny flame a spark of rebellion in the dark. The world exploded in light and sound. The kerosene-soaked wood erupted with a hungry, concussive whoosh, and the lean-to became a roaring inferno. Flames shot 50 feet into the night sky, painting the snow-covered valley in a hellish, dancing orange light. The sudden violent heat could be felt 100 yards away. Daisy, whom Adelaide had freed moments before, screamed in equine terror and bolted into the woods, a phantom of chaos adding to the bedlam. Kane and his men whirled around, their faces once smug and confident, now masks of slack-jawed shock. Their siege, their cover of darkness, their tactical advantage all had been incinerated in an instant. Their positions were exposed, their shadows thrown into sharp, vulnerable relief. This was the signal Clayton had been waiting for. He didn't hesitate. He burst from the doorway, not as a target, but as an avenging angel wreathed in firelight. He ignored the stunned gunman, his entire being focused on a single target. He charged directly at Buford Kane. The cattle baron, frozen for a fatal second, had no time to react. Clayton hit him with the force of a runaway train, a collision of bone and muscle that knocked the smaller man clean out of his expensive saddle. Kane's rifle flew from his grasp as he hit the ground with a sickening thud. Simultaneously, the first shot from the darkness racked through the chaos. Adelaide, now positioned in the shadows of the creek bed, had become a hunter. Her shots were not wild. They were a surgeon's work. She wasn't aiming to kill. She was aiming to control. A bullet kicked up a spray of snow and mud inches from one man's boots, sending him stumbling back in panic. Another shattered the stock of a rifle held by a second man, the weapon flying from his numb fingers. Her message was clear. This was her valley, and they were no longer the predators here. Panic, contagious and swift, ripped through Kane's men. Their disciplined line had dissolved. They were being attacked from the front by a seemingly possessed giant and picked apart from the flank by a ghost they couldn't see. The fight between Clayton and Kane was brutal elemental. It was a struggle in the mud and melting snow, illuminated by the roaring fire. Kane, recovering his wits, scrambled to his feet and drew a long, gleaming bowie knife. He was wiry and quick, his movements honed by a life of casual cruelty. But Clayton was fueled by something far more potent, a righteous, burning fury. He fought for Rose, for her mother Lily, for his beloved Martha, for the quiet peace this man had shattered. Kane lunged, and the knife sliced through the thick fabric of Clayton's coat, cutting a shallow, burning line across his forearm. Clayton barely registered the pain. With a roar, he swatted Kane's knife, hand his blow, so powerful it sent the weapon spinning away into the snow. Before Kane could recover, Clayton grabbed him by the front of his fine, mud-stained coat and lifted him from the ground, the man's boots dangling uselessly. "She will never be yours," Clayton snarled, his voice a low, terrifying growl that was more threatening than any shout. He held the sputtering, terrified cattle baron in his iron grip, and in that moment, Buford Kane, the man who owned a territory, knew he had finally met someone he couldn't buy, bully, or break. The fight was over. Seeing their leader captured, his face pale with terror, and with Adelaide's rifle still a threat from the shadows, Kane's remaining men lost their nerve. 2 of them had already vanished into the woods. The others, their faces illuminated by the dying flames of the lean-to, slowly raised their hands and let their rifles fall into the snow. A profound silence descended, broken only by the crackle and pop of the burning timbers. Adelaide emerged from the darkness, her rifle held at a relaxed but ready position. Her face was smudged with soot. Her hair had come loose from its bun, and in the flickering firelight her eyes blazed. She and Clayton looked at each other across the 20 yards of trampled, snow-dusted ground that had been their battlefield. No words were needed. They had done it. As dawn began to bleed its soft, grey light into the eastern sky, another sound broke the quiet, the steady rhythm of approaching horses. A small posse led by a weary but resolute man rode into the clearing. It was Sheriff Brody from Redemption. Clayton's gamble sending a message with a passing trapper days earlier had paid off. The sheriff took in the surreal scene, the smouldering ruins of the lean-to, the bruised and mud-caked cattle baron tied securely to a tree, the disarmed thugs looking sullen and defeated, and the formidable pair standing guard. He dismounted, his eyes lingering on Adelaide. He knew her only as the reclusive parson's widow. He never imagined she was capable of this. He listened patiently to Clayton's story, punctuated by Adelaide's terse, factual additions. Clayton produced the worn letter from Lily, its words a final testament against her father. Brody read it, his expression hardening. He looked at the arrogant, still defiant face of Buford Kane. Buford Kane, the sheriff, said, his voice heavy with the satisfaction of long overdue justice. I've heard your name whispered on the wind for years, always attached to trouble that vanishes like smoke. Looks like your reach finally exceeded your grasp. He gestured to his deputy. Take them. All of them. It seems we finally have witnesses who aren't afraid to speak. As the sheriff and his posse disappeared over the ridge with their prisoners, a new quiet settled over the valley. It was the same quiet Adelaide had known for 7 years, but its character had been irrevocably altered. It was no longer the sound of emptiness. It was the sound of peace. She and Clayton stood on the porch watching the sun crest the mountains. The morning air was clean and cold, tinged with the smell of wood smoke. Clayton had a crude bandage torn from her apron, wrapped around his bleeding forearm. My lean-to is a pile of ash, Adelaide said, not with accusation, but with the flat finality of an inventory taken after a storm. I'll build you a new one, he replied, his voice soft but firm. He looked at the charred ground, then back at her. Bigger. Stronger. She followed his gaze, then her eyes drifted to the cabin door. From inside they could hear the first faint fussing cry of Rose waking up. It was a sound that now signaled not an intrusion, but the beginning of a day. The beginning of a life. The soil is good here, she said, her voice thoughtful, as if seeing her land for the first time. Good for more than just a small garden. The valley could support a small herd. Clayton looked at her, and a slow, weary smile touched his lips. He understood her meaning perfectly. Thomas's dream, he said softly. A single tear traced a clean path through the soot on her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. A new dream now, I suppose. He reached out his calloused fingers, hesitating for a moment before gently brushing her arm a touch that was both tentative and deeply comforting. Adelaide, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. You saved us. You saved me. She turned to face him fully, the morning sun lighting the weariness and the strength in her face. You brought my world back to life. Clayton Monroe, she replied, her voice barely a whisper, yet carrying the weight of 7 years of silence. I think we saved each other. The fortress of her grief had not just been breached. It had been burned down and rebuilt into something new. In its place stood the foundation of an uncertain yet fiercely hopeful future. A man, a woman, and a child. Not a replacement for the family she had lost, but a new one forged in fire and loyalty. The silence was finally truly gone, and for the first time in 7 years, Adelaide Parsons was not alone. She was home. The story of Adelaide and Clayton isn't just a tale of the Wild West. It's a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. It shows us that even in the deepest silence of grief, the heart can learn to hear again. It proves that a fortress of solitude can become a sanctuary for others, and that family isn't always the one you are born into, but the one you fight for. Theirs is a journey from the ashes of loss to the dawn of a new beginning. A reminder that the most profound strength is often found when we finally allow someone else to see our scars. If their story of resilience and second chances moved you, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who appreciates a story with real heart. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true-to-life tales from history's forgotten corners. Click that notification bell so you won't miss our next story. Thank you for listening.